You've probably never heard anybody reference before the eyes of the spine, unless you're a kid who said your mother has eyes in the back of her head and can see you, which my kids can't wait to grow up to be able to do that too. But what I'm going to talk to you about is the way that your brain gets feedback. And if you've never heard the word proprioception, I'm going to explain it a little bit now. Proprioception is a sense of where are you at in time and space. It matters a lot. We know athletes are constantly trying to improve their proprioception because we know that it matters with agility and how they can react, which is fantastic. But what we notice is there's some people that really lack proprioception. They lack the input of where they're at in time and space. They're really clumsy, maybe their gait is off, but also their senses start to get off. So let me explain it to you exactly how that happens. So if you think about your body, you will always be able to see your hands and see your feet. You can look down. If you don't know where you're at, you'll be able to see those and be able to keep tabs on those. Now, when you start to think of losing proprioception and losing your sense of balance, I want you to think of somebody that's elderly, that maybe moves a little bit slower. You see their body kind of hunkered over. Their body's not getting quite the same reception that they're looking for back to their brain to know where their body is at, and they start to lose proprioception. They start to become a fall risk. I want to explain that to you and how it happens to people even in their younger years, that they don't have the right feedback to the brain. Because you've got something in your spine that we call the eyes of the spine, because you can never see your spine. Your brain and body relies on information from your spine feeding back to the brain to say, this is where I'm at, this is how I'm moving, this is what's going on. And 60% of what your spine and spinal muscles do is send information back to the brain saying, this is where I'm at in time and space. There was a scientist that was highly awarded called Richard Sperring, who figured out that at any given moment, your brain, 90% of what it's doing is proprioception. And we really take that for granted, how it feels to be coordinated. Now we can see someone who's really uncoordinated, they've done it to themselves with too much alcohol. Now that's losing proprioception. They don't have a real good sense of balance and where they're at in time and space. And I mentioned the elderly, but we've also seen kids that are off with their balance. They've got a slap gait, they've got loud gait, that's when the feet slap down, or they're toe walkers, or they're just really uncoordinated. They're unable to catch and throw balls. And granted, we know that the genetics are going to play into some of the athleticism that's going on, but we can really start to identify it when these kids are having a huge battle with clumsiness and their inability to be coordinated and hang out with their peers and be able to run and keep up and play, because the eyes of the spine aren't working the way that they should. So there's something called muscle spindles. Those are the little eyes. And every time they move and stretch, this stretch receptor sends information to the brain to say, oh, this is where I'm at. This is what's going on. Now what happens when the spine isn't moving well? When something's locked up, it's fixated, and it's jammed up. We talked about this in an earlier video called dyskinesia. Dys meaning a dysfunction, kinesia meaning movement. The movement isn't there. Now the brain isn't getting the information. It's trying to fill in the blanks. It has some, instead of proprioception, we have something called nociception. It becomes noise where the brain's trying to fill in the blanks of where this is at. Now 60%, like I said, of your spine is sending that information back to your brain. 33%, so over half of that is coming from the upper cervical spine. So something we pay really close attention to is what's going on in and around that brainstem. And I also brought a diagram that I was showing you guys earlier of what we look at when I'm looking at a brain and then, a spine and a skull. And you can see the brain that's on there. You can see the brain stem, which is that red organ, and then one that has dyskinesia, one that's dysfunctioning, one that we see a lot with something like this, which is a cesarean section birth. And it doesn't even have to be a C-section. We use that and it's a little bit more dramatic, but every birth, and I can't say every, 99% of what the research has found is that a baby has some form of neurological interference at birth, and that's from natural all the way to surgical births. We know there's some degree of neurological interference, there's some degree of dyskinesia going on in their spine. So what we've found is that the more severe it is, the more severe we see the children neurologically challenged later on in life, and sometimes even during infancy when they can't turn their head, nurse latch, they're colicky, they're constipated. We start to see the signs then, and later on it starts to manifest into bigger issues such as behavior issues, meltdowns, hard time sleeping, like we talked about with the coordination, clumsiness, a lot of kids that are super irritable and maybe not willing to listen. We see people with broken volume controls is what we call it, where their senses are turned up too high or senses are turned down too low, and there's sensory seeking and sensory avoiding that starts to come into play with this. So if you love this kind of information and you want to know more, I want you to join me for my next Perfect Storm. I want you to register on perfectstormidaho.com and sit down and listen. It's an hour, a little over an hour's worth of information. You can actually get continuing education if you're a teacher, which is fantastic because we need teachers to be able to identify this kind of stuff with our children to get them a little bit more help. Well, we need to know what's going on in our kids' brains and our bodies and how it got there, because it's not just a cesarean section birth that can do this to our kids. There's a lot more going on in our environment and what we need to sit down and have a really close look at. So join me.